I first moved to Spain in 2009, and believe it or not, you could still smoke indoors. In tapas bars, in restaurants and bars at night, they were filled with smoke, and in 2010 they finally banned it, and it was great. Everyone said, hooray, even the smokers didn't want this cloud of disgusting smoke. I didn't even like to go out at night. It was just terrible. You'd come home smelling like the 1990s. It was all very retro. They finally banned smoking. Everyone was really happy, and it was part of a long campaign that actually started in 2005 here in Spain to reduce tobacco consumption. And back then there was about 33% of people smoked, and now there's more. That's right, you heard me right. It has failed. Banning smoking indoors, increasing taxes, all of this stuff has totally failed here in Spain, where now 34%, more than 1/3 of the population aged 15 to 64, smokes. It's crazy. Why is it not working? On the flip side, why is the US working so well? Why is there 14% of people smoking, and in many areas, single-digit percentage people smoking? How can it be so successful there and such a fail here? I don't know the answer to that. Some people theorize that it's the readiness, the availability. There still are cigarette machines around. There's very little ID checks. It's socially acceptable for a couple of 12-year-olds to sit on the corner and smoke. No one will call their parents or smack them over the head like they might in some other places. Those are my theories as an outsider, but hey, what do I know? My guest on this week's show does know. She studies habit, why bad habits form, how to form good habits, the role of friction and cues and context and social triggers and belief systems. And it's really, really important if you're trying to change anything in your life, whether it's exercising more, eating better, sleeping better, treating your dog better, whatever you're trying to do. It's really important that you understand how your actual wiring works, because the way that you think you make decisions and form habit patterns in your life, it might not have anything to do with the reality. If you're new here, this is the Lucas Rockwood Show. Every week I go out into the world of health and wellness, and I try to bring the best thinkers I can to you and their best information. These might be medical doctors or yoga teachers, breathing experts, meditation teachers, and everyone in between. Hopefully we'll give you some actionable insight that you can put to use in your life. As always, your questions, comments, and feedback are most welcome. Email me at podcast@yogabody.com. Send me a voicemail, yogabody.com/Ask Lucas. And if you like this show, share it on social and tag me. It's at Lucas Rockwood. Enjoy. So hello and welcome everyone. Today's show is called How to Break Bad Habits, and I am joined here with Wendy Wood. Wendy is a psychologist and provost professor of psychology and business at USC, where she's been a faculty member since 2009. Her primary research contributions are in habits and behavior change, which is what we'll be chatting about today. And she's the author of a new book. It's called Good Habits, Bad Habits, and she has a website, goodhabitsbadhabits.com, and the book's available there and also on Amazon. Wendy, welcome to the show.
Good to talk to you, Lucas.
So I'm American, but I live in Spain. I've lived here for about a decade, and the smoking rate here is still about 34%. And right after I first moved here, they got rid of indoor smoking, which is surprising. That was just 10 years ago. And from what I understand from reading statistics, which of course, you have to be a little careful, but it seems like smoking has actually gone up, not down here. And 34% is a lot. And in the US, from what I understand, it's around 14%. And even that to me seems shockingly high in, like where you are in academic circles and things like that. I'm sure it's single digits. And the US campaign to stop smoking has been the most effective thing I've ever seen. I've lived abroad now for 16 years. I've never been to any country where there's such a successful habit, and cigarettes are very, very addictive. So I'm curious, in your research, have you thought about the smoking tobacco issue specifically, and how, whether it's top down or bottom up, or how that habit seems to be breaking? Because it really does seem to be working.
You're right. It's been a wonderful success story here in the U.S. And I think that the U.S. did a number of things to make smoking more difficult, less pleasant, less easy for us to do. It's almost as if the government added friction, so added some pressures to stop people smoking with taxes, with bans in smoking in public places, and with removing them from the store shelves, so that you actually have to ask somebody in order to buy cigarettes, and we don't see ads for them anymore. So this was a tremendously successful behavior change campaign. Almost half of us were smoking in the 1960s. And as you said, the current data are closer to 15, 14%, although that varies greatly across the country because in states where smoking is not banned in public places and states where taxes on cigarettes are lower, smoking rates are much higher.
And so what can we learn from that? So people listening who are not smokers, but they're thinking like, wow, I wish I could do that with Haagen-Dazs. And Haagen-Dazs is pretty expensive, but somehow it's still in the freezer and somehow I'm, eating a pint of it every day. How can we learn from, 350 million people, really, really successful? It seems like it always amazes me when most of my interactions now, of course, are with people who are not from the U.S., and I try to explain it, and I just can't make heads or tails of it. It's really worked. Like, it's really, really worked. And the whole mentality, from my generation at least, it's just that smoking is not just bad for you, it's that you're a bad person. It's really ingrained in me. And I smoked when I was younger, but I felt like a bad person. When I was doing it, I felt like a bad person too. I felt like I was stepping out on my better self.
Yes. The anti-smoking campaign really took off when we started to realize that secondhand smoke was a problem. And then your smoking not only affects you, but all the other people around you. And that gave the government the political will to start making some changes, the changes we talked about. And it's interesting to compare the anti-smoking campaign to another health campaign which used a very different approach, and that is the 5 a day, trying to get us to eat more fruits and vegetables. That was almost solely an educational campaign. And this is more the way we try to change our behavior, right? It's we become aware that we're doing something that's not good for us. We start learning about how we should change our behavior and the reasons for it. And we start to think through how could we do it. And the 5 a day campaign was very informative because it provided evidence that you can change people's attitudes and convince them that they should be doing something different, like eating 5 servings a day. And indeed, the campaign was very successful at changing attitudes, but it's had absolutely no effect on behavior. Because eating is something we do very habitually.
Right.
And so our understanding of what we should do is very different than the factors that are controlling our actual behavior. So I think that's informative because we so often take on new behavior change challenges by motivating ourselves and educating ourselves and getting ourselves trying to exert willpower to make things happen. And that's just not as effective as the kinds of strategies that were used in the anti-smoking campaigns. I was going to say that your question about how to apply these insights to our own lives, I think, is a very critical one. And we don't have the ability to change public policy in the same way that we have the ability to change our own life circumstances. If you want to stop eating Haagen-Dazs, the way to do this, based on the anti-smoking campaigns, is to make it more difficult, to add friction to that behavior so that you don't have Haagen-Dazs in the house, you actually have to go get it. If you do keep it in the house, you don't make it very easy to access, so that you have to think before you make that decision to go ahead and follow your habit. And a second way to do it is to disrupt the cues that are activating that behavior. Because habits form when we repeat an action in a specific context, like your living room in the evening, or whenever it is that you tend to eat ice cream, and you continually perform a certain action in a given context and get a reward, which in this case obviously is the taste of the ice cream. Over time, you form mental shortcuts or habits so that when you're in that context again, the first thing you think of is ice cream. So you want to block that automatic association as much as possible. So changing what you're doing in the evening is also another way of disrupting the habit cues.
And what about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation? Like you mentioned with the smoking, a big part of it is from a policy perspective, the government was able to make decisions because a smoker's actions are affecting other people. That I understand from a top-down policy perspective. From a personal policy perspective, from your research, is there any indication that that is a good, better, or equal motivator? Meaning, if what I'm doing today will harm someone else, will I be more or less motivated to change than if it's just affecting me?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think that our habits are very responsive to motivation in general, because they tend to be cued regardless of whether we want them to or not. Habits are motivated by the rewards we got in the past. And that's why we learned that specific shortcut is that mental shortcut that represents our habits, is that we got this reward and it was consistent enough so that that became the thing that we do. Whether the reward is present now in your current situation is not quite as relevant. And that's part of the challenge to habit change. And it's not something, habits don't follow the same logic as our sort of conscious decision-making selves. We only have access to that part of our mental functioning, the conscious part. Habits follow an associative learning model that's very different. And so applying our conscious thought to it, that's where we get in trouble.
That's a really interesting insight, because I think most people are trying to muster up the motivation, and maybe they're approaching it wrong. I guess the challenge is some habits. I always say that I like everything that's bad for me, whether it's bad food or alcohol or whatever it is. I like all that stuff. And the question is, why do people? I don't use those things, but I like them. Why do we like them? And the insight that I've been given is the reason. Why is someone drinking a 6-pack of beer every night? Why is someone binge watching Game of Thrones? Why is someone? And pick your habit. A lot of those kind of guilty pleasure habits, the reason that they're doing them is because it makes them feel better. Feel better than what? Well, better than 10 minutes before. And so, while you're eating the Haagen-Dazs and binge watching Game of Thrones, you feel better than you did 10 minutes before. Now, the downstream effects of that, you might end up feeling way worse than you did at the end. But in the short term, it really works. And that would be a habit that in some ways could be thought of as self-soothing or self-medicating, or however you want to phrase it. But we also have habits that are just negative all the way through. And so like behavioral habits, like let's say someone has a habit of losing their temper and screaming. Let's say someone has a habit of foul language or something. And there is no immediate reward. In fact, there's just pain and humiliation, and yet it's still a habit. How do you think about those two things? The self-soothing thing, which is just obvious. Sit down with a pint of ice cream, you'll feel better, at least for a moment. And then the habit of acting out, the habit of self-harm, of harming others. And I don't necessarily mean that physically, but verbally or emotionally shutting down, which is something that people have that even while it's happening, they're not. There's no real gain, and yet it's still a habit. How do you separate those two kinds of behaviors?
Well, I think our experience of those two types of habits is very different. But the habit mechanism is sort of the same for both. If they're automated into a habit, then there was some reward at some point for the behavior. And we tend to think that what we find enjoyable and our familiar comfort habits are things that anyone else would find enjoyable. But you've been, if you're living in Spain, you realize that there are huge cultural differences in that. And we might find ice cream in the evening enjoyable, but people in Spain might not agree. My friends in Denmark think that eating herring is the most pleasurable comfort experience that there is. And herring is very good for you. It's not one of those guilty pleasures necessarily. So my guess is that we focus on those particular behaviors because they're problematic for us and we're having a hard time controlling them because they're habits, because they're automated. We don't understand how they work. The habit mechanism is a very general one. And my guess is that you have many really positive habits also that make you feel good. Yoga, for example, given who you are and what you do. These are behaviors that are similarly habitual, but ones that we don't struggle with because they're working for us. And that's why I wrote this book, is because people don't really understand, and there is no way to understand the habit mechanism just by intuiting and experiencing our behavior. Habits are part of the non-conscious, and the way we learn them and the way that we perform them is very different from our decision, the way we make decisions. So using our decision-making logic to try to form new habits or control the ones that we already have just doesn't make sense. It's not going to work. You have to understand how habits themselves are structured and how they persist. And recognize that both good and bad habits have the same cognitive and neural basis to them. What makes them good or bad is just how consistent they are with our current goals. And so your exercise habits are, I assume, quite consistent with your goals, and so not something that you struggle with or think about much. But drinking habits, overeating habits, those also can be just as automatic, and they do cause us problems once we develop ones that are not working for us. So that's where understanding of habits comes in useful, is how to change those. Back to our earlier conversation, the CDC didn't understand very well how to get people to eat more fruits and vegetables, and still hasn't really figured this out. But the U.S. government did figure out what the mechanism was to control smoking habits. And as you said, nicotine is one of the most addictive substances around. But it gives you an idea of how effective it is to put a little friction on our behavior. Let me give you an example. So a phone company in 2017 started analyzing distance that people traveled to their local gymnasium. Because we all know that our cell phones are being used for all sorts of data analytics purposes. And what they found is that people who traveled 5 miles or more to a paid fitness center only went about once a month. But people who traveled only about 3.5 miles went 5 times a month. So that simple difference of 1.5 miles shouldn't be important, we would think, right, in predicting whether we would go to the gym. But in actually determining whether we do, it makes a huge difference. People are just much more likely to go to the gym if it's easy, if there's little friction associated with the behavior. And living close to your gym or having a gym that's close to your work is one way to make it easy, because then you can integrate it into your lifestyle without having to work very hard to get there. And that made all the difference for these, for the people in this study. That's the kind of insight into our behavior that we don't have just because we believe that we are able to overcome those kinds of small obstacles. We don't recognize friction.
Yeah, I own and operate 3 yoga studios, and this is always what I tell people too. When I meet people and they ask where the studios are, I tell them the location, and depending on where they live, I will say, go to this studio, or I will say, go to somebody else. Like, don't even come to ours. It's too far. And too far is exactly what you said. For me, it's 10 minutes. It doesn't really matter. That's kind of the number that I use, 10 minutes. Whether, here people walk a lot or they take the train or whatever they take, but it doesn't really matter where you are in the world. If you drive or if you take the train or you take an Uber, whatever you take, if it's more than 10 minutes, I just say, forget it. Go to the place that's closer, or you just won't go enough, and so removing friction there, I've just found, and when I look at my database of my clients in my studio, I am shocked at how many people have a mailing address on the same street as the studio. And it just is what it is, the less friction, it just makes a big difference. So in the same way you talked about adding friction to, get rid of stuff like smoking, reducing friction for positive things, from what I've seen in the business side of things, really makes a big difference as well, which is why I tell people to buy multiple sets of workout clothes. So the clothes are never dirty. There's always an extra set of clothes. Lay your clothes out by the door in the morning. Not to trick yourself or anything like that, but just one more thing. Tell people to buy nice clothes so they feel good when they get into them. These kinds of little simple things. And with food, this is another thing that I've been teaching for years is don't just buy food and throw it in the refrigerator. Do some basic prep, chop some vegetables, throw them in a container, take your proteins and chop them up and throw them in the freezer so they're in individual wraps. Again, reducing friction so that when you come home after a long day and you're stressed, dinner's not a 45-minute ordeal, it's a 20-minute ordeal. And it's just those little teeny things, it just makes a huge difference in terms of compliance, but it's really hard to have that. It's really hard to have that foresight when you go grocery shopping on Sunday and you throw a bunch of things in the refrigerator and you assume you're going to have a really great week, and then by Thursday, Friday, you've had takeout 3 nights in a row or whatever it is.
Yes, exactly. And all the lettuce is brown. Yes, we've all had that experience. And that's one of the wonderful things about prepared or prepackaged and pre-cut fruit and vegetables. I try to buy things as close to serving state as possible when they're healthy, because then I know I'm much more likely to use them.
So we've talked about friction, adding friction to get rid of bad habits, removing friction to increase good habits. We've talked about cues. So obviously, if you're trying to stay away from alcohol, don't hang around bars, this kind of things. And we've talked about how motivation probably isn't the biggest thing. What we haven't chatted about, which for sure informs habits, are belief systems. So, for example, someone who grows up Muslim, for example, is probably going to have an easier time staying away from alcohol as a general rule. Someone who grows up Seventh-day Adventist is probably going to have an easier time becoming a vegetarian, for example, just as a general rule. It doesn't mean that, there's not individuality there, but how do belief systems in and around habits and, looping back to the cigarette thing, this has really become religion. It's become belief where, at least in my generation, people who smoked were bad. And that became a belief that it was a bad choice for bad people. And when we did it, we were doing it to be bad. And I'm curious about your research, if you've looked at beliefs and how they inform both good and bad behavior.
I think beliefs are important in a couple of ways. They're not part of the habit learning mechanism, But they do influence what we find rewarding. So if you ask U.S. kids what is their favorite comfort food, they probably talk about pizza and peanut butter sandwiches. As I was saying, my friends in Denmark, even their kids think herring is the most comforting food to eat. So belief systems and experience, your own personal experience, make a difference in what you find rewarding. And so what you're likely to form habits around. Because habits form mostly for actions that we find rewarding in some way. But you know, our belief systems also determine what we're going to be exposed to. So if you go spend much time in Utah, you don't have the same access to alcohol as you do in other parts of the country. And that's not necessarily a part of your belief system. It's just part of what you're exposed to and what your choices are, your daily choices are. You don't see people, if you're Mormon, you don't hang around people in the morning who are drinking coffee. So you don't have that as part of your own day. It's not part of business meetings and other sorts of things that are in that particular milieu. But there's another way in which beliefs come in, I think. So we talked about rewards, determine what we find rewarding, that it determines what we're exposed to. But I think that we also, there's something comforting about our habits and what we're used to that leads us to start liking them. And there was a great study done a couple of decades ago by a friend of mine who showed people pictures of their faces. Now, you may know that the mirror image you see when you look in the mirror is the reverse of what everyone else sees. And all of our faces are slightly asymmetrical. So what we're used to seeing, the image of ourselves that we're used to seeing, is quite different from what other people are used to seeing. And what my friend did is he brought people into the lab and showed them the identical picture, one of which was a true image and the other which was a mirror image. It was the reverse. People liked their mirror image photo better. And to give you an idea of how asymmetrical our faces are, few people recognized it was the same picture. Right? And they liked what they were used to seeing, what they were familiar with. When my friend when my colleague who was doing this study, he had participants then show the picture to their friends. And their friends liked the true image better. So we just like what we're used to seeing and doing. And I think our beliefs get built on our habits as much as our habits are determined by our beliefs. Another example, so along with photos and what we're used to seeing of our faces, another example is seatbelt. So seatbelt laws emerged in this country around the 60s and the 70s. And they started with auto manufacturers offering these as options. And then the data started to become clear. People didn't want to use seatbelts, but the laws were put in place. And then once we started using them, having to use them, we all started to think they were the right thing to do. And now, if you see somebody in a car who doesn't buckle up their kids, you probably think they were terrible parents. But even 40 years ago, 30 years ago, that wasn't part of the U.S. belief system. That really developed more as a product of us using seatbelts regularly and sharing the information about the safety, the safety of using them.
So why did that campaign work, that education campaign, is it because the stakes are higher? But this 5-a-day campaign we talked about earlier, everyone got really educated, really believed, and didn't take any action. They sound like the same thing, except one worked and one didn't.
Well, there were legal implications. It didn't start to work. It didn't matter until it became part of the law where you have to buckle up. So this is another case in which education campaigns, they just weren't that effective. But making people do things, then we come to justify it. We come to understand why we're doing it.
It's almost like a case for a benevolent dictatorship or something like that.
It is, unfortunately. We're not always the best, We don't always make the best choices. We tend to make ones that are low friction, and we tend to make ones that feel good to us. And often that's the most familiar thing, not necessarily the best thing.
So for people listening, I'm sure almost all of them buckle their seatbelt without a second thought, and they feel awkward and uncomfortable when they don't have their seatbelt buckled. But I bet a bunch of people, when we mentioned that 5-a-day thing, they went, 5 a day. I know that. I'm not doing that. I listened to this show. I'm not doing that. So how can they use what we've just chatted about? How can they superimpose some sort of something, remove some friction, add in some cues, change a belief? How can they use what we've just chatted about to use those two examples where they can make eating 5 a day as effortless as clicking the seatbelt, which for sure it's not right now?
I think that your suggestion earlier is a great one. Get in the habit of at least partially preparing all fresh food that you buy on the day that you buy it, so that when it's in the refrigerator, it's almost ready to eat. And my version of that is even lazier. It's buying things that are partially prepared already for you, so that you don't even have to think about washing the fruit and vegetables or cutting them up. That's already done. All you have to do is start cooking. So the hardest parts of change are the first few times you do something. If you repeat things in the same way each time, so you go down the same grocery store aisles, you get used to walking through the produce aisle before you do anything else and filling your basket up there. If you get used to doing that, that's going to become your automatic response, and it's not going to take a struggle. So it's just a matter that the willpower or the decision-making is required only initially. First few times you do something, and each time you do it, you're going to have to think less and less and struggle less and less. It will become your go-to thing.
It's great. It almost seems like the 5-a-day campaign should have focused on like grocery shopping and food prep and making it seem like a silly idea to throw a head of broccoli in the refrigerator before you chopped it or something like that. It's almost like the focus on the academic head game is kind of a moot point if people aren't, if they don't understand the way that habits are formed.
They convinced us. There were jingles, there were stickers associated with that campaign, but that's too far removed from our behavior. Unless you make it easy and rewarding, you remove the friction, you find ways to make it so that people can do it as part of their daily life without having to think much about it. It's not gonna happen.
It's a really great insight, because to sandwich that next to like the Got Milk campaign, which was ridiculously successful, and then you think about the friction of consuming dairy products, there's almost none, right? So, I mean, milk is drinkable or mixed into whatever. It's available everywhere. Yogurt products, cheese products are all takeaway ready-made. It's kind of the opposite problem. Like in the U.S., dairy is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's inexpensive, and it's as convenient as can be. It's like a frictionless It's like a frictionless suggestion. Does the body good? Oh, great. There you go. Chug, chug, chug. Off we go. And the other one is like, let's go to the garden and start, learning knife skills and learn how to saute and steam and complicated. There's just a ton of friction into making that change.
Wash everything.
Exactly.
Get it ready on the table. Yeah, it's really a challenge.
This is a really interesting conversation, Wendy, and a timely one. We're coming up on the end of the year, and people are going to be making New Year's resolutions and things. You've invested a bunch of time in a book. A book is a huge project, I certainly know. And what are your hopes with the book in terms of the message you'd like people to walk away with?
Well, the reason I wrote the book is because I wasn't seeing much about the science of habit out there. Because we can't intuit or introspect about our habits, so much of the popular culture on habit is just wrong. It's just false. It doesn't match what we know from research. Might match our experience of the world, but that's not necessarily the same as what's actually driving our behavior. So I wanted to give people some insight into the mechanics behind habit formation and do it in a way that would be useful to them in changing their own behavior and living more the life that they wanted to. Because it's easy to see people struggle with this a lot. I think we all have at different times in our lives struggled with different habits. So my hope was to provide people with a bit more understanding of how to change their behavior and be successful at it.
You gave me pause with what you just said. So even though someone's experienced something to be true, it might not be true in the context of habit. Is there a specific example that comes up? Because I'm sure some people are thinking exactly like me, that they think they've figured themselves out, and what you're suggesting is maybe it's just a correlation, not a causation.
Exactly. So going back to the seatbelt thing, we all think we wear seatbelts because we're responsible people who take care of ourselves. But the data on seatbelt safety was available for a long time before the laws were passed. And we were all responsible, thoughtful people back then too. But it didn't translate into our behavior. So what we understand and what we think, the reasons that we think we do things are not necessarily what's actually driving our behavior when it comes to habit, simply because the mechanism is not accessible to consciousness. So we don't have any awareness of the automaticity that's driving our habits. We can't. That's part of the nature of how habits work. That's part of the beauty of them, because it means we can drive and think about something else. We can take a shower and plan out our day. That's the functionality of habit. We don't have to think about it. But that makes habits hidden from our conscious experience. So our interpretation of why we do them is not necessarily what's actually driving the behavior.
Wendy, really great conversation. I'm excited to dive into your book. I really appreciate your time, and thanks for coming on the show. We've just opened enrollment for our 2020 yoga teacher training programs online and also our online challenges. And we're offering an early bird special, which means you can buy one and you get a second course for free. That includes our online yoga trapeze training, our breath coach training, gravity yoga training, my 21-day biz accelerator, all of our challenges, backbend challenge, hip opening challenge, sugar detox. And it's a really great opportunity if you want to set the stage, plan for a really great 2020, both personally and also professionally. I'd encourage you to check it out. Pop on over to yogateacherscollege.com. It's a limited time as we come up on the end of the year. Again, 2-for-1 special on our online yoga training programs. Very much looking forward to the new year, and I hope we can study together. This week's nutritional tip is in response to a listener question. Listener CK writes, Lucas, what are your thoughts on meal timing? I've heard that a lot of bodybuilders eat 5, 7, or even 9 times a day to stay fueled and to stay lean. Is this a good idea for most people? I appreciate the question because I talk about this a lot. It's really important that you model your life after a life that you want. And so if you're not a bodybuilder and you're modeling your diet and your lifestyle after a bodybuilder, that can really go awry. If you're not a triathlete and you're trying to eat and live the lifestyle of a triathlete, you're going to make some choices that don't really make sense. The famous example is Michael Phelps, the Olympic swimmer. Back in his peak of his competing career, there's photos of him online eating something crazy like 12,000 calories a day, and that included Pop-Tarts and big stacks of pancakes and, probably 1,000 grams of carbs, maybe even more per day. And of course, Michael was lean and ripped and muscular. So if you try to eat like Michael, it's not going to work, right? Because he's spending 6 hours a day in the pool and he's got this youthful metabolic resilience and things like this. And that's an extreme example, but I see it all the time. I see it all the time where people are modeling their diet and their lifestyle after a lifestyle they don't have and they don't aspire to have. So it's really important that you get clear on what you're trying to do. When I meet most people, what most people are trying to do is lean out, meaning they're trying to reduce their amount of body fat. They're trying to stay energized and feel balanced with their mood. They're trying to regulate their sleep and their stress. Pretty reasonable things. Most people I meet aren't trying to run the Badwater ultra endurance race or whatever it is. And so when you look at it from that perspective, you start to shift your perspective. In terms of meal timing, here's the deal. Your body really likes to have periods of no food. And there's a whole slew of research, more and more every day, on the importance of having some downtime, some digestive downtime each day. And at the very least, 12 hours between dinner and breakfast, and ideally 14 and maybe even a little bit more. But, at the very least, 12 hours of turnaround between dinner and breakfast. Again, the word breakfast, break, fast, it's not coincidence. It's really important that there's a fast there. It helps to regulate your blood sugar. It helps your body to cleanse itself. It helps your organs of elimination do their thing. It helps to reduce inflammation. Pretty much all of your really 30,000 foot view biomarkers improve very, very quickly simply by changing meal timing. So for most people, it's a terrible idea. In direct response to your question, it's a terrible idea to eat 5, 7, 9 times a day. For most people, in fact, they'll do better with eating less frequently. Now, some people listening are shaking their head and they're saying, Lucas, no way, I'm cycling, I'm cycling 300 kilometers a week and I'm running. Okay, different story, right? But for most of you listening, you're living a relatively sedentary life. Maybe you work out 3 or 5 times a week. Maybe you're working an office job. You're sitting behind a computer right now listening to this, or you're driving in your car on the way to work. For most of you, 3 meals would be a max. 2 meals could probably benefit you. Some of you might even experiment with 1 meal a day. And the important thing to remember is people say things like, doesn't eating more meals speed up your metabolism? Metabolism is defined differently by different people, but sometimes the idea is like we want our heart to race, so our heart will burn calories. We want to burn more calories so we can eat more calories. There's a cyclical, nonsensical logic to this idea of burn more to eat more, to burn more to eat more, to go to the gym so you can eat bad food so you can go to the gym more. This kind of bizarre cycle is something that shows up in pop health and is very rarely questioned, but you need to question it. The other thing to remember is that someone who's in really great shape actually has a really slow heart rate, right? They might be in the 40s, might even be in the 30s if they're an elite athlete. And so metabolism is a little bit different. It's not just about your heart racing. It's not about this quote unquote afterburn effect. Most people would define metabolism in terms of metabolic health, which would be defined by things like your sensitivity to leptin and insulin, your body's ability to manage blood glucose, your A1C levels, your overall management of sugars and carbohydrates throughout the day, along with a number of other factors like inflammatory factors and things like this. All of these things come to play. And so the idea that you as a average person want to wake up with a cranked up metabolism, with a racing heart, jacked up on coffee, revving all day long to burn calories so you can eat bad food, so you can go to the gym, so you can burn calories, it doesn't make any sense. In general, what we're looking for is a more balanced state. We're looking for metabolic health, not a cranked up metabolism, whatever that actually means. So for most people, big long answer. For most people, it makes sense to eat 3 meals a day. Less is more often. Most people in the yoga body world are eating 2 meals a day. And some people, especially during times of cleansing, hormonal reset, weight loss, they might shift down to even 1 meal a day plus a snack or something like that. There is no one size fits all. Everybody's lifestyle is different and everybody's lifestyle is changing and your needs are changing. What works for you today might not work for you 3 or 4 years from now. That's important to remember. But on a very fundamental level, here's what you need to remember. Breakfast should be breaking a fast, and that fast should be at least 12 hours. Add a little bit more and you'll get into a sweet spot in terms of how many meals per day. For most people, less is more, and you can really go a long ways with that. Hope that's helpful. We have a listener question this week from Sunil, and Sunil asks, Lucas, what are the best poses to do to fix back pain? This is a really common question and a really challenging question to answer because back pain is so different, and the solution, there's no one size fits all solution. But here's one paradigm that I like to use when thinking about joints. Whether we're thinking about the joints of the back, your knees, your shoulders, whatever it is, whatever joint it might be, even your wrists. There's 3 things you need to consider. One is strength of the muscles surrounding the joint that support the joint, so strength. Number 2 is flexibility or mobility, meaning the range of motion in that joint. Is it natural? Is it healthy? And number 3 is balance, and this has to do with a couple of factors, but primarily balancing of sides. So if we were looking at our right hip versus our left hip, are they equally strong and long, meaning loose and open and strong, or are they unequally tight and short? And if we have a massive difference in our mobility and our strength of our right hip and our left hip, that can lead to all kinds of movement, postural dysfunctions that can lead to injuries as well. So Sunil, when you're thinking about your spine, I would overlay that paradigm: strength, flexibility, and balance. So rather than just trying to throw 3 perfect yoga poses at the problem, I'd encourage you to throw exercises, practices, poses from each of those 3 categories. So working both on the strength, specifically of your posterior chain, that basically starts from your heels all the way up to the back of your head. So that would include everything from your calves and your hamstrings and your glutes, all the way up to your erector spinae muscles, all the way up to the back of your head and neck. And that would be the strength element. In terms of the mobility, the flexibility, both flexion and extension of your spine are really, really important. Of course, there's other ranges as well, but let's talk about just flexion and extension, forward bend and back bend right now. And the balance element is one that we might need to chat about a little bit. And this is ensuring that you have right-left balance in terms of the muscles that support your spine. Very often, if you're right-handed, for example, you'll be tight and short on your right side and loose and weak on your left side. And that could cause a bunch of dysfunctions. The poses that help best with balancing right and left are asymmetrical poses. So in the case of back pain specifically, things like a pointer pose, which is like a dog pose with one arm and one leg up, those can be really helpful. Bear crawls, which you do on the ground, can be really helpful. These are asymmetrical walking on all fours. That can be really helpful for balancing out the muscles that support the spine. And then simple dynamic things like what we might call a Superman pose, or like a Bhujangasana, like a cobra pose. These kinds of things can be really helpful, especially when you do them asymmetrically. So when you do one side and then the other side, those can be really effective for balancing out right-left imbalances. So long answer to your question, Sunil, but in terms of looking at your spine, rather than throwing 3 poses at the problem, let's think about 3 approaches to the problem: strength, flexibility, and balance. Hope that's helpful.
This week's iTunes review is by ScoopScoop123. ScoopScoop123 says, "Overall, great show with a lot of fun, interesting material. I appreciate the attitude of constant curiosity. Thank you, ScoopScoop123. You have won the Yoga Trapeze. Email us at podcast@yogabody.com and we will ship it to you."
If you're a regular Yoga Talk Show listener, you'll definitely want to get on my email list. Go to yogabody.com/sign me up. When you enter your email address there, we always have free giveaways every month: yoga straps, water bottles, discounts in our shop, and all kinds of other things. When you sign up at yogabody.com/sign me up, I'll send you just 1 email a week with updates about the show, special offers, new courses, and valuable information that I think you'll find useful. So go to yogabody.com/sign me up to claim your free prize now.